Tonight, of course, is Thomas McEvilley. Eric Orr will be introducing him. Before we get to that, I'd just like to mention that Richard Serra, due to the litigious nature of Tilted Arc in New York, won't be able to lecture in the fall, and on orders of his lawyer. And Michael Graves is tied up with his work and will be coming out in the spring sometime. Consequently, this is the final lecture of the series. I want to thank you all for coming to what I think has been rather successful. There will be a reception again tonight. Real quickly, I'd like to thank Herbert Nadell and Partners, Ross Wu, Dworsky, and John Jurdy again for their support. And here's Eric Orr.
It gives me more than great pleasure, as they say, to introduce an old and dear friend of mine. That, for your knowledge, is one of the most clear, penetrating, incisive person that I've ever met. And I think that'll probably come through to you. Tom, by nature, is a poet, gypsy. His second nature has been the classics. His absorption rate on information is blinding. His humor is generous, as he is. And I'll say no more. Tom McEvilley.
For the room. Oh, here we go. So can we turn those off? Thank you. So, even more, please. It's not a common experience for me to speak at a school of architecture. I especially hadn't anticipated being the culminating speaker in this series. I don't, in fact, speak much about architecture. I'm not going to directly speak about it tonight. I'm going to be speaking about the human figure. And insofar as architecture is also about the human figure, I think that much of what I say will have architectural implications, though I'm not necessarily going to bring them out one piece at a time. I'm going to be talking primarily about pictures. We're going to be looking at something over 100 images, which will help us to investigate certain types of content in art, certain types of content which I think are always there, though they are seldom acknowledged or critically used. They are a major hidden reason why art is so important to us. I want to talk first, before getting into the images, about two themes. When I say I'm going to be speaking about the human figure, I'm going to be speaking about the way that human beings have represented themselves in art, primarily in representational art, though I think this type of content is present in abstract art too. And before we go any farther, I want to get into these two words, representation and self, a little. The word representation appears to mean a presenting again. It suggests that something is presented once in nature and then is presented again in a picture or whatever form of representation. That is to say, it implies a kind of neutral transfer of information. Of course, it's not that simple. There's lots of differences between a pictorial representation and the thing. The picture is flat. The thing is three-dimensional. The picture is enclosed in a rectangular frame. The thing exists in the fullness of space. The picture is one size, the thing another. The picture is in one place, the thing is in another. The picture has one past and future, one value and purpose, and the thing has others, and so forth. Picture, in other words, is not a real presenting again of an object in nature. It is a symbolic presenting again. The quality of likeness in a picture, I mean, when we say, let's say that a certain picture looks like something, the quality of likeness in a picture is determined to a degree that cannot precisely be specified, not by an objective similarity, but by conventions which vary from culture to culture and from time to time. These conventions of picture viewing, picture reading might even be more to the point, are ingrained in us in childhood, and they permanently affect the way we see the world. For example, in the Renaissance conventions of perspectival rendering, the convention was to indicate the convergence of parallels only in the depth axis of a picture, not laterally and not vertically, unlike nature, of course, where parallels converge in all directions. This convention is still largely observed in so-called realistic picture making. We've been so deeply drawn into our inherited representational conventions that when we stand out of doors and look at an urban scape with architectural parallels extending in all directions, including upward, we tend only to see convergence in the depth axis, not laterally and not vertically. In other words, the reality of our pictures has gotten in between us and the reality of the outside world. The reality of our pictures, you might say, is the visual reality of our world. Now, conventions of representation differ from tribe to tribe. They're really kind of tribal inheritances. And when you're born into a certain tribe, you just tend to assume that the conventions of your tribe are objective. We tend to assume that our pictures look like the thing, and that the pictures produced by other cultures or tribes do not really look like it, but somehow miss it. Comparative ethnology has showed us that this is really a kind of groundless and arrogant presupposition, that canons of representation seem to be highly relative. What would have looked like an accurate objective representation of an object to an Old Kingdom Egyptian is very different from what would seem accurate and objective to a medieval Chinese or to a modern European. The habit of assuming that our own pictures look like things, and that our own pictures, in other words, show what the world is really like, it might be called image reification, on the parallel with the phenomenon of linguistic reification, whereby people tend to assume that their language is an accurate map or grid of reality. I just want to bring up one example that will demonstrate in our recent experience this relativity. Within living memory, architectural drawing was all done, primarily done by perspectival renderings. That is to say, parallels converge and distant things appear smaller than things in the foreground. Various pictorial traditions in the world have presented ways of rendering space which do not involve the convergence of parallels and the diminution of size of things that are in the background. These traditions, for example, certain early Greek modes of drawing and Mogul painting, used to look kind of wrong to us when we assumed that the Renaissance perspectival renderings were objective and accurate. Recently, however, I think in architectural drawing, perspectival renderings have been replaced to a very large extent by axonometric renderings, wherein parallels do not converge and distant things do not lose size. Now we do it that way and it looks right to us. This is an example of the relativity of these conventions that has happened, I think, literally within our memory. Now, I want to talk briefly about representation of the self. We're going to be looking at a lot of pictures from a lot of different cultures, and we're going to see what art tells us about the changing ideas of human selfhood, about what it feels like at different times and places to be alive in a human body in a human society. representations of the human face and figure are like acts of self-definition by human beings. That is to say, traditionally anyway, they are assertions or claims about what it means to be human. On the same principle as with our blindness to certain types of perspectival convergences, the way that we're accustomed to seeing humans represented in pictures will have a lot to say about the way we feel ourselves to be. Our pictures, in other words, make us as much as we make them. There is this constant interaction between modes of representation and modes of selfhood, and that is what we are going to be looking at. There are a variety of indicators from which we can read out of representations of human beings the presuppositions about the nature of selfhood and its relationship to the world. One of these indicators is how the figure is presented in relation to space. And before I get into the pictures, I want to talk briefly about a psychoanalytic concept of space, which, by the way, I believe has architectural applications, though I'm not all that sure in detail about how to work them out. I'm referring to a concept that was developed in that area of psychoanalytic theory known as object relations theory. That is to say, the analysis of the development of the personality before the onset of the Oedipus complex. In other words, in about the first 3 years of life. This concept is associated nowadays very popularly with the British psychoanalytic author Donald Winnicott. Actually, it goes back to a classical Freudian named Geza Roheim, who talked about what he called the dual unity. Roheim talked about how the infant, first in its mother's womb, and then during the early years of life, at certain times when, let's say, nursing or falling asleep in its mother's lap or on its mother's breast, that at such times the infant gets into a state where its own ego boundaries and even the boundaries of its body seem to kind of dissolve and flow outward, and it seems to merge with this enveloping warm embrace. Roheim called this the dual unity. More recently, Donald Winnicott has suggested that as we grow up, we don't forget the dual unity. We take along with us a kind of feeling of mental space, the particular feeling which Winnicott calls potential space, and that is the term that I'm going to be using for it for the rest of the night, which is a very deep memory of that infantile experience of the loss of ego boundaries and the merging with the world outside. Potential space is a kind of buffer around the ego, which shelters it somewhat from the hard edges of the outside world. Potential space is a fluctuating area around every ego, which expands and contracts constantly as it is needed by our experience, an area in which our own ego boundaries become loose or indefinite, and we have a sense of merging or projecting ourselves onto the world. Winnicott suggests that potential space is the space in which games take place. It's the space in which fantasy takes place. It's the space in which certain types of mystical experiences take place. It may be the space in which art actions occur also. Potential space, the amount of potential space that each of our personalities gets, which probably has more to do with early experiences of mothering than with anything else, and after a certain age, like maybe 3, never changes again. The amount of potential space which each of us has built in is one of the key indicators to the nature of his or her personality. Someone with too little potential space is constantly in a confrontational relationship to the outside world. There's no buffer. There's no zone of loose ego boundaries that can be called up to create a kind of a dazed state in which the hard edges of the outside are not felt so strongly. Someone with too little potential space in their personality is apt to be very brittle in relation to the outside world. Someone with too much potential space in their personality, on the other hand, is apt to be, let's say, a silly person. A person who is too dominated by fantasy and imagination and who tends easily to project his or her fantasies onto the outside world without any clear awareness that the outside world is a different thing in itself. So let's have the first slide. And can we really take these lights out? No? Okay. We're looking now at one of the earliest human self-representations in art. It's a reconstructed drawing of a cave painting in the cave of Trois Frères in France from the Paleolithic period, the Aurignacian Magdalenian period. The famous caves of Lascaux and Altamira and so forth are in the same neighborhood. In other words, this painting of a male human being is from somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 BC. He is known as the sorcerer of Trois Frères. That is to say, he is assumed to be a shaman or sorcerer who is presented on the wall of the cave temple in his performance regalia, doing his dance in front of his fellows. As a human representation, there's certain odd points about him. He has antlers. He's got what seem to be feline ears, the face and eyes of an owl, the front hands or paws probably of a bear, a tail that some experts have identified as feline, and it's also worth pointing out that the picture it also features what Leo Steinberg has taught us to call an ostentatio genitalium, an exhibition of the genitals. There are quite a number of these representations of Paleolithic shamans on those cave walls. They all basically show these same characteristics. That is to say, we are looking here at a stage of the human ego development when it would be an understatement to say that the ego boundaries are loose. The sorcerer's self has flowed outward and inhabited a half a dozen different species of animals. He has merged in with nature. He has dived beneath the surface of the pool of nature and is just down there underneath it, essentially in a kind of a state which is like semi-conscious. A kind of a state which does not seem to be keenly aware of itself as a separate subject looking at a world which is a separate object. Rather than looking at it in that confrontational way, seeing it self and other, subject and object, the sorcerer of Trois Frères has flowed out in all directions and diffused his ego throughout nature. Now, you might say that the whole world is his potential space. It is a genre of ego representation that is characterized by the absolute dominance of potential space, of the space where dreams happen, where fantasies happen, where games and rituals happen, and so forth. The representations of human females from this period are extremely different from the representations of human males, and similarly are an iconographic bundle that is very tight and that is repeated over and over again. There are about 60 of these figurines, this is only about 8 inches high, which are known as the Paleolithic Venuses. This is the so-called Venus of Willendorf, one of the most famous. She exhibits certain iconographic qualities which all of the Paleolithic Venuses exhibit. She is corpulent, probably pregnant. Her body tends to center itself around the midsection. Her hands see her little tiny hands are lying on top of her breasts in a gesture that iconographically represents the act of pressing milk out of the breasts, expressing milk from the breasts, in other words, offering nourishment to the world. It is, of course, a goddess figure. She has virtually no face. which means that she is not recognized any more than was the sorcerer as a separate ego with its own self-awareness and its own subjectivity that is very clearly delineated from the object realm out there. She is practically, as the sorcerer is, let's say, a quintessential representation of someone engaging in potential space or someone who has dived into it, the Venus of Willendorf is virtually an embodiment of potential space itself, of that mothering embrace in which the initial experience of potential space takes place. The fact that her hands are so tiny and that her arms are atrophied indicates that she is not perceived as an agent. She is not perceived as someone who is going to reach out to the world as an object out there and manipulate it to her subjective intentions and purposes. Her legs, furthermore, dwindle off to little tiny atrophied feet, which indicates that she is not regarded as mobile. She's not expected to move around in the world and to grab things and manipulate them. She is a passive principle that is like kind of eternally there. Now we're going to take an enormous leap in time. Oh, no, we're not. We're going to stay right where we were. In looking through the remains of Paleolithic art, I've only found 2 attempts to represent the human face in the kind of portraiture without costume and without animal attributes, without potential space, without the trappings of potential space and fantasy, to represent the human face or figure more or less in the way we do. And this is the one that would be regarded as the better of the 2. And now, we know very well that these Paleolithic artists were enormously skilled draftsmen. We're all familiar with the great animal portraits. What went wrong here? See, it's not that they couldn't draw, it's that they didn't really know what they looked like. It represents an absolutely childish stage of the ego, like a drawing of like a 3 or 4-year-old child, still in the area of the dominance of potential space before the Oedipus complex has set in with its drive toward competition and accomplishment and conquest and so forth. Now we're going to take that huge jump in time. We're looking here at an Egyptian tomb painting. We have refocused our attention on the period around 3000 BC in the ancient Near East or Middle East, the area known as the Fertile Crescent. Representations of Egyptian deities still show the Paleolithic feature of the mixed form, that is to say, a basically anthropomorphic form with animal attributes which represent a kind of clinging to potential space as they did in the Paleolithic era. If we look at representations of Egyptian pharaohs, whose roles in their society were essentially hieratic, that is, religious, and of course the society's religious images are usually the slowest to change, and that's what we're seeing here. In this residue of Paleolithic iconography that still clings to the early Bronze Age art of ancient Egypt, if we look at representations of the pharaohs, we see that they also still have the accoutrements of potential space or of the fantasy life about them. For example, the serpent which grows out of the frontal lobe of the pharaoh. We have here a really classic means of representing Egyptian pharaohs in the Old Kingdom period. This is the Pharaoh of Macrinus. He is presented between 2 women, and we might assume maybe that they're, his wife and mother or whatever, but they're not. They're both goddesses. And look at the way that they are holding him. Each of them has her arm around him and then is grabbing very tight on his arm on the other side. In other words, they're propping him up. He's like a dummy stuck in between them. It's to be understood, again here, we have the remnants of the obsession with potential space, the lap of the mother. The goddess Isis was known as the throne or lap on which the Pharaoh slept. It's to be understood that when you looked at the Pharaoh, even though what you may have felt that you saw was simply a male human being, it's to be understood that these invisible supporters from the realm of potential space are always invisibly there. And there's an enormous number of them that are constantly hovering around Pharaoh. Here we see the hawk that is constantly over his head in the form of the protective deity Horus. Here we see the ram, which is constantly standing right behind him as the protective presence of the god Ammon. That is to say, the feeling of the pharaonic role in society was one that, like the sorcerer of Trois-Frères, is still totally enmeshed in potential space and shot through with the elements of fantasy life. If, however, we turn our eyes away from the hieratic art of ancient Egypt to the secular representations of ordinary people of whatever class, then we suddenly find that the animal attributes and the other accoutrements of potential space, the other projections of fantasy life onto the outside world, have disappeared. The ego seems to be emerging into a type of self-awareness which is more like the self-feeling that we have, where it doesn't see itself as mixed up with the attributes of the world out there, but as something peculiarly human. Something whose species is no longer vague, something which is no longer dissolving in the swamp of nature, but is quite clearly aware of itself as a particular species different from others. Now, if we turn our attention to the art that was happening at the other end of the Fertile Crescent in the early Bronze Age, that is of ancient Mesopotamia, we find even more prominently a new type of ego awareness or feeling of what it is like, what it means to be a human being. For one thing, in representations of human beings, there appears this enormous emphasis on the face and eyes. Jungian authors have written very intelligently about this. They talk about a force of upwardization which happened at about this time. This is, of course, around 3000 BC in the Fertile Crescent, is the time when virtually all of the qualities, the bundle of qualities that make up what we call civilization, all came into being almost overnight. And I mean literacy, metallurgy, architecture in durable materials, the formation of national states and imperialistic ambitions, and related qualities. These are what we have traditionally come to call civilization. At the same moment that this set of qualities, which represents an increased ambition to control the world out there, was coming into existence, the idea of where the center of a human being was radically shifted. In the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages, most representations of human beings suggest that the center of the human being is in the area of the genitals, and that the essentially human act is the procreation of more humans. Now suddenly, the center has moved up to the face and eyes. The procreative act has been replaced by a kind of cognitive act as the essentially human trait. The defining human trait has come to be seeing the world out there. Not merging into it, flowing into it, but seeing it as something that is out there, separate from you. You are a subject. It is an object. At the same time that this group of controlling traits grew up, and that the idea of the center of the human being, or the defining quality of human selfhood, moved from the procreative to the cognitive center, there arose an iconography which began to celebrate not attempts to merge with nature, as the sorcerer of Trois-Frères did, but attempts to master it in the most aggressive way as something that is absolutely distinctively separate from you, which you are going to reach out and take a hold of and manipulate for your own ends. First of all, images of human intervention in the natural process. You see, this could not have occurred in the Paleolithic age, where human intervention in the natural process was made by means of infiltrating the world of nature itself, of flowing out of one's own ego boundaries into nature. Now we see the human male, especially, represented as something which is very aggressively attempting to master nature, to set itself off from it. These icons that we're looking at now are all cylinder seal impressions from the mythology of the primal hero figure who is named Gilgamesh. Here he is, with the forces of nature efficiently tamed and tucked under his arm like a pup. At the same time, increasingly orderly types of pictorial arrangement were also stating this message that the human will is going to be imposed upon nature. This type of icon, where there is a central figure, a central axis with a human figure in it, which is symmetrically or heraldically flanked by two representatives of nature, which are in submission to the central human figure, which in this case, of course, is a king. I mean, we also have to realize that this iconography grew up as an expression of Oriental monarchies, intense monarchies that relate somewhat to that phase of government and society that anthropologists have called the big man phase, where society is centered around a big man, and everything else, proceeds in orderly ranks outward from this center, which is the source of the will which orders both society and nature around it. This icon of the hero or monarch mastering lions or wild beasts of some kind in each hand, sometimes called the Gilgamesh icon, sometimes it's called the dompteur, French word which means the dominator or master. It is one of the key icons in human history. It was so important that it diffused from Mesopotamia literally around the world. We're looking here at two examples from Shang Dynasty bronzes in China, that is to say, from around 1500 BC in China. And we're looking here, seeing the little group in the lower left and then in the lower right are stylized examples. The central male human figure, and he's got in his hands the forepaws of these two wild animals whom he is holding in submission. This example is from about the 7th century AD from the Irish ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England. This icon even diffused into pre-Columbian Peruvian textiles. Now, we've seen so far two great and very different pictorial representations of ideas of human selfhood. The sorcerer of Traffrere and the dompteur icon. They could hardly be more opposed to one another. The sorcerer operates by deliberately lowering his ego boundaries and diffusing his ego into nature. The dompteur operates by deliberately tightening his ego boundaries and enforcing his will on nature as an object out there. Now we're going to approach another sequence here. We're going to approach what happened a little bit in ancient Greece, some things that happened. And I want to approach it by way of some goddesses. We're looking here at another of those Paleolithic Venuses, so-called. She has the same traits. She has virtually no feet, no face. She's all centered around her hips and breasts. And again, I hope you can see her little tiny hands lying on top of her breasts in that gesture of pressing out milk for the world. Here we're looking at a ceramic goddess statuette from a Neolithic site in Turkey known as Çatalhöyük. In other words, you can see her more clearly in the drawing. This is from about 6,000 BC. In other words, there's something like 10 to 15,000 years separating these two representations of a human femaleness. And yet the iconography still holds absolutely. The centering in the procreative area, the almost blank face, the feet which aren't meant for walking, the hands lying on top of the breasts, pressing out milk. This is one of the longest and most persistent iconographic sequences in history. The breast offering gesture. This is an example from another Neolithic site in Turkey where the hands offer the breasts by lifting them up from beneath to be suckled on rather than pressing on them from above. This change in the motif became kind of dominant for the next 1,000 years or so. I want to focus our attention on the Hittite ivory figurine on the right there, that cute little goddess. I think she's a transitional figure. She has the very emphasized pubic triangle, the emphasis on the hips, the breast offering gesture, which put her in the tradition of the Paleolithic and Neolithic Venuses. And yet at the same time, she has a very highly animated and developed face and dominated by her eyes. This is a transitional figure in the iconography of the female. Again, a Hittite example of the another form of the breast offering gesture. Now, what we've seen is that the association of the representation of the female with fertility attributes and the offering of the breast was more or less static for something like 20,000 years of art history, a remarkable persistence and consistency. Now, from what we've seen, this of course is the Venus de Milo, Venus found on the island of Milos. From what we've seen, we would assume that we could guess what she was doing with her hands, right? I mean, there's only one thing that goddesses do with their hands that we've seen so far. But we have other examples of this genre which show us that in fact she's doing something quite different. This is the so-called, a Roman copy of the so-called Cnidian Aphrodite, the original attributed to Praxiteles. The dramatic moment that all of these Aphrodite, that the Greek genre of Aphrodite sculptures represents traditionally, is that she has been surprised in her bath. All right, just as she has emerged from her bath, she has been taken unawares and she is covering up. She's using her right hand to cover, and with her left hand she's grabbing for the towel. Again, you see, after 20,000 years of offering the breasts, the idea of human female selfhood has now radically altered to a gesture of covering them up and withholding them. Here with her right hand, she, as it were, fends off the approach and even the gaze of the intruder, while with her left hand she wraps the garment around her. At the same time, if we look closely at her face, we see that she is extremely intelligent. She is now a fully sensitive ego center. Her eyes are very prominent. The human female, this is an Athena, a sculpture of Athena. Again, there is above all that look of intelligence in the face, certain gentleness, but a powerful intelligence. The human female is now, for the first time in history, represented as a separate ego center, self-aware of itself as such and making its own decisions, presenting itself very confrontationally and very masterfully to the world out there without any confusion about its ego boundaries and without any hint of a sense of passivity. Now, at the same time that this change was taking place in the representation of the human female, this icon of the human male appeared in the so-called Archaic period of Greek culture, which is roughly 750 to 490 BC. This type of icon of the human male is known as the kouros. In Greek, it simply means the young man. but actually iconographically it means more than that, because like the Aphrodite sequences or others that we've seen, the kuroi, that is the plural, always had certain traits. For one thing, they were always totally naked. Every attribute of potential space has been stripped away, except the hieratic posture based on the posture of the Egyptian pharaoh, with left foot extended forward. It is an icon of an ego which has stripped itself bare of fantasied attributes, which is directly as itself confronting a world which it clearly sees as other than itself. It is an icon of seeing. Furthermore, not only is it seeing, but it is striding into that world. It is striding at the world to meet it. It is almost creating the world by its act of seeing. You know, the Kouros figure was dominant at roughly the same time that the philosopher Protagoras made his famous remark that the human being is the measure of all things. Often inaccurately translated, man is the measure of all things. Think about the sorcerer of Trois-Frères. What was the measure of things for him? Certainly not the human being, but the world of the natural species outside the human being. The Dompteur is on his way to this point of the sense of clarity of ego separation, the sense of kind of an inner strength that does not even seem to need any attributes of potential space to buffer itself from the outside world, a very dangerous stance to take toward the world. The last trace of, it's about the same time, by the way, that in certain areas of Greek art, perspectival renderings were being developed, a highly significant fact, because perspectival renderings involve implicitly a subjective point of view is built into the picture. That is to say, parallels are converging in relationship to a viewer, so that in a perspectival rendering, there is always this very clear demarcation between subject and object, between the self who is looking and the world which is extending itself and converging parallels away from the self. The other half of the Kouros, as it were, is the development of perspectival renderings in Greek stage trappings of the time. Now, I've mentioned that this figure does still have one traditional religious element, and that is the stance which is based upon the stance of the Pharaoh Macrinus as he stood between the two goddesses. By the 4th century or so, even this was gone. We're looking here at a Roman copy of a sculpture by Polykleitos called the Spear Bearer. There's several things I want to say about it. First of all, like the it's of course a development of the Kouros, but it has shaken off the last remnant of religious tradition, which was the stance like that of the Pharaoh. He is standing at the athletic grounds, perhaps waiting his turn in the spear throw, leaning lightly on the spear which is held in his left hand, and watching the person who has just gone before him. His nakedness, his complete self-possession, his absolute cool and confidence and poise are things which, without the bravado of the Dompteur, you know, who's got the lions in both hands and is really showing his mastery. There is no bravado here. It is an absolute casualness. The most amazing innovation in the figure is that it doesn't know we're looking at it. All the earlier representations of humans that we have seen know that we're looking at them. The sorcerer was performing before an audience. The Dompteur is manifestly standing out there at the center of the universe, declaring his mastery for all to see. Now, for the first time, we see a representation of a human being which is so into its own center that it does not notice that it's being looked at. It's candid camera suddenly. Its eyes go off to the side. It doesn't look at us confrontationally. It looks idly and casually past us. This, again, is quite a radically new sense of what it means to be a human being, what it feels like to be a human being. We're looking here at a cup. Could I have help on the focus of that? I'm not getting much response from the focus button here. We're looking here at the inside of a cup by the Sosius painter from about 500 BC, when this transition is very intensely in the air. It illustrates a moment from Homer's Iliad. Now, just think of the Iliad, that vast panoramic spectacle, and think of choosing one moment from it to portray in art. I have the highest respect for the mentality that made this selection. It's a moment when Achilles is bandaging the wound of his friend Patroclus, who has come back wounded from the battlefield. I suggest that these representations of humans not only bring along with them ideas of human selfhood, they also bring along with them ideas about society. You can read out of the Sorcerer of Traffrere the whole complex of traits of tribal shamanic society. You can read out of the Dompteur the so-called Oriental despotism. And I suggest that what you can read out of this plate by the Sosius painter is the feeling of the emerging Greek democracy. The heroes are not shown at a moment of triumph. They're not mastering their lions. One of them is wounded. The other is demonstrating compassion. They don't know we're looking at them. We're totally behind the scenes at a tiny minor moment off-center in the war. The sense of the development of the human ego into qualities of relationship, which may not quite have been accessible to it before, and into a way of relating to society, which may not have been accessible to it before, is, I think, quintessentially present in this image. The Patroclus figure is in such pain that he braces himself by his left foot against the border of the cup. The use of the added white paint is so restrained and intelligent. The bandage, which is at the center, and this is not insignificant, the bandage, the act of compassion and ministering, is seen now as at the center of human nature, and the teeth of the figure who is in pain, the idea of human suffering and ministering to suffering, are brought out by the white and are presented as a kind of ideology of humanness. Now, I want us to look at a series of pictures of facial expressions from Greek sculpture, which underwent a rather remarkable change, which seems to me that it has a lot to do with reflecting history and society, that we can read a lot out of it, a lot more than is ordinarily read out of it. All the figures in the Archaic period, when democracy was just emerging, when the secularization of the self was just happening, human figures from this period always wear this charming smile, which is known as the Archaic Smile, and is characteristic of the Archaic period. It seems to me to suggest a kind of a devastating naivete, similar to the way that the Kouros was striding naked into the world there, without any potential space to buffer him. There's something about the Archaic Smile which is like inviting the outside world, like as to say, come to me, do your trip on me. In about the year 490 BC, the Archaic Smile suddenly and totally disappeared, and it was replaced by this absolutely level and neutral gaze, which has sometimes been called the Olympian gaze. Above it all, much more wary than the Archaic Smile, much more distant and wary. This is the Apollo from Olympia. And here again, an Apollo, a bronze head, which shows again the coldness, really, of this distanced gaze. What effects the transition from the Archaic Smile to the Olympian gaze is the Persian Wars, which occurred between 490 and 480 BC, and suddenly, like, as it were, took the naivete of the young emerging Greek democracies and, really buffeted it about. The Trojan Wars, the Persian Wars were like the hard news about the world out there. And the childishly delighted smile is replaced by this very distanced, very intelligent, very contemplative way of relating to the world out there. Very careful, not telegraphing your feelings, at times even a bit pensive, almost sad, almost melancholy at times. Now we're going to look at the first human being in history to be represented sad. Here he is. He is the orator Demosthenes, who was always represented as very worried and unhappy because he foresaw the end of the Greek democracies and the reimposition of a kind of big man government under Philip of Macedon, acting in imitation of the type of Oriental monarchy that, for example, had invaded Greece in the Persian Wars. I mean, we're seeing like an old nightmare coming back. The highly integrated society that was the polis, which was of the classical period, which, by the way, also involved as part of its definition a complete architectural integration of things, very specific, with very specific requirements. The polis passed into the Hellenistic monarchies, as they're called, in the third period of ancient Greek history, the Alexandrian period. And at this time, the characteristic facial expression of Greek sculpture became this. This is the standard icon for representing Alexander the Great. But it was not only Alexander who was represented in this anguished mode. It became the standard mode of human self-representation in the early Hellenistic period, the period of the loss of the democracy. It's not as if these people are, let's say, wounded and physically dying. Their egos hurt. You know, they walked naked out into traffic at that Kouros stage, and now they've paid for it, and they're feeling it. It's a feeling about human selfhood and about what it means or feels like to be human that I think has a lot in common with the later European phenomenon of romantic agony. Now we've just taken another of these huge leaps. We're looking at one panel of an altarpiece by Giotto. After a certain point in human history, a kind of an oscillation set in, where a period of expanding potential space would be followed by a period of shrinking potential space. The medieval Christian period was a period of expanding potential space again. In this representation by Giotto, several features of potential space are present. For example, the angels flying about, which are projections of human fantasy elements onto a representation of the world out there. The fact that the figure in the background on that hillock is actually maybe a little bigger than the figures in the foreground. So there's absolutely no hint of a subject-object dichotomy. There's no one looking. There's no one in relation to whose subjectivity distant things get smaller. Here is another work by Giotto. Now, isn't that just a beautiful representation of potential space as a thing like an aura breathed off of the human self, the space in which he is enclosed, even though it has, of course, developing elements of the rediscovery of perspectival rendering in it, leans and embraces him, as it were. The space leans into him. It's part of him, as it were. It's not a thing that is perceived as distinctly separate from him. Another 14th century work by Martini, which has same basic characteristics. You see, the kind of crazy rambling of the architectural renderings, the fact that background figures are every bit as large as foreground figures. In other words, there is no foreshortening. Hence, there is, as it were, no distinction between subject and object. Now, of course, we've all seen this before. Leonardo's Last Supper, which was made in about 1500, after the rediscovery of linear perspective system based on a single vanishing point. Now, usually when we look at this picture, or when we think of it, we tend to see the foreground element, that is the table and the figures. They are often picked out as if they were separate from the surround, especially in parodies, like, say, the parody in the movie MASH, where the architectural surround is simply ignored. But I suggest that the architectural surround is every bit as meaningful as the foreground elements. There is a very aggressive assertion of the otherness of space. There's a very aggressive assertion that space is not an aura emanating off of a human self, but that it is a three-dimensional thing extending away from a human subject, different from a human subject. It is a three-dimensional grid almost, which encloses the figures and holds them in a kind of dream of reality. It's based upon the assumption of a viewing subject which is standing dead center in front of the picture and in relation to whom the single vanishing point of the architectural rendering arises. The presence or absence of perspective in renderings of the space around human beings is one of the great indicators of the type of human selfhood or feeling of human selfhood which obtained at the time of that representation. This work by Perugino does the same kind of thing out of doors. The grid work in the pavement with the parallels vanishing into the dark doorway, the extravagant exhibition of perspectival renderings in the distant architecture, and the fact that the human beings occur at different distances, and of course background figures are much smaller. That is to say, there is an assertion being made here that the world is a place in which human beings may move around. They can move away from the surface, toward the surface, not just laterally. In most of the art, aside from Greco-Roman perspectival painting, which is almost all vanished, in most of the art prior to this period, figures moved laterally across the surface of representation. Now they move either toward the viewer or away or laterally. There is a sense of selfhood exercising free will. There's a sense that space is the real space of the external world, not a fantasied space, and that its purpose is to provide a theater in which humans may act out their free will, moving about in this space with a kind of godlike freedom. Here we're looking at Raphael's School of Athens. Now, the Renaissance development of perspectival renderings represents a shrinkage of potential space after the blossoming of potential space in, worlds of angels and demons and so forth in the period of medieval Christendom. This sense of this assertion of the clarity of the ego that is involved, the clarity and separation of the ego from the world, which commences strongly in the Renaissance. I mean, it had already had an oscillation in the Greek period, you see. Now we're looking at another one. It commences strongly in the Renaissance, and it continues to develop and assert itself more and more strongly through the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment. The Renaissance really, in a sense, continues to unfold itself through the 18th century. And then we're going to look at a sequence which begins to take it in the other direction. which consists of the so-called Romantic period. I mean, what the so-called Romantic period was about after the period of the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment was an attempt to regain potential space again, after essentially renouncing it in the image of ego clarity. The Romantic period was about regaining potential space, attempting very deliberately and consciously to somehow effect a merger with the world out there, such as the sorcerer of Traffrere had no problem doing. This is David's painting of Madame Récamier of about the year 1800, that is to say, right at the end of the Enlightenment and early Romantic period. It's a classical Enlightenment idea of human selfhood and the ego. For one thing, the clarity of her outline. You see, in European painting after the Renaissance, mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries, a different set of indicators for the ego's representation to the outside world arose. And this was, one of the great indicators was the so-called figure-ground relationship. In works where the figure tends to dissolve into the ground or be engulfed by the ground, the ego, potential space is expanding enormously, and the ego is submerging itself in the universal surround of nature again. In works where the figure stands out in very clear outline and separation from the ground, the ego is asserting itself as something different from the world about. We'll see that in this case, the figure is very clearly marked off from the ground. We don't need all that elaborate perspectival apparatus that the Renaissance used. We already know that. The little hints about the floor receding to the wall are quite sufficient to let us know that she is enclosed in a three-dimensional cube of what we would call real space. Furthermore, she is looking right at us in the most confrontational way, in a way which asserts very aggressively, I am something different from the world about. We'll see that in this case, the figure is very clearly marked off from the ground. We don't need all that elaborate perspectival apparatus that the Renaissance used. We already know that. The little hints about the floor receding to the wall are quite sufficient to let us know that she is enclosed in a three-dimensional cube of what we would call real space. Furthermore, she is looking right at us in the most confrontational way, in a way which asserts very aggressively, I am separate from you, much as the Kouros did. I'm a separate ego. I am separate from you, looking at you. Now, one subject, subject, object, object, subject. The distinction is absolutely clear. Now, this is David's portrait of Napoleon from maybe 12 years later, when David was beginning to feel and to incorporate into his work the very strongly emerging romantic feeling of selfhood, which is emerging at this time, let's say, for example, in the music of Beethoven. The romantic feeling of selfhood is like a tumultuous, heroic disintegration of the self into nature, a redispersal of the self through nature. Napoleon was a great iconic figure of early Romanticism, and Beethoven's heroic symphony, based on him, was the warrant of it. David shows Napoleon as an aggressive, manipulative hero, like, say, the Dompteur, so that he gleams out from the ground, but only to an extent. The darkness of the ground, and this happened increasingly in David's works of this time, the darkness of the ground and the darkness of his hair and coat create an ambiguity, really, in certain areas about where the figure ends and the ground begins. There is a certain, the edges of the figure are beginning to shred so that it can flow out again into a merger with the outside world. In other words, so that potential space can expand. Now, we're looking here at a work by Delacroix from around mid-19th century, where the figure-ground relationship is becoming very ambiguous. The ground is very alive, The ground is not like this passive thing against which the figure or ego sets itself off. The figure and the ground are kind of flowing into one another to an extent. It's happening again here. Figures are arising out of the ground and disappearing into the ground. There is a sense that the human ego will be eternally reprocessed through nature, that sense which was so powerful in Romantic literature. For example, a work almost contemporary with these paintings of Delacroix, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which is totally about the attempt to disperse the ego throughout nature. In 1855, in 1857, Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, again, a work which is very much about expanding potential space and weakening the claim of the ego as opposed to the surround. This is a portrait by Cézanne from 1866 in which he exaggerates the effect which David worked with in his portrait of Napoleon of course, the face and hands of the figure still leap out, but the ambiguity in, let's say, the lack of contrast between the figure and the ground shows the direction that we're going in. Here's a self-portrait by Cézanne from a few years later where the edges of the figure are beginning to really shred. I mean, look, for example, at his right shoulder. The blurriness of the features, the way that the ground and the figure are worked by the brush in the same way, so that the ground and the figure are iconographically asserted to be more or less one continuum. The figure is not all that separate from the ground. Suddenly, in the works of Van Gogh, the ground totally comes to squirming life and asserts itself as the more real element of the figure-ground pair. The ground is more alive than the figures. The figures are petty and minor in comparison with the ground, which is constantly moving up around them as if to engulf them. Van Gogh, also, like Cézanne, often presented the figure very close-hued to the ground, so that the separation between the figure and the ground was minimized. Now, I'm going to make a leap here, but I'm going to assert that this romantic tendency which we're seeing to allow the figure to flow into the ground, to allow the ego to disperse itself into nature again, continued as a very strong force throughout the remainder of the 19th century and throughout about the first half of the 20th century, where really still a kind of romantic idea or feeling of selfhood was very strongly in effect till sometime after the Second World War. Now we're going to make a big jump. This is de Kooning's great painting Woman 1 from 1950 to 52. The figure and the ground are in absolute chaos in relation to one another. Each of them is flying apart. They're more or less the same. This is the follow-up painting in the series, Woman and Bicycle from 1953. It is, in certain areas of the painting, virtually impossible to distinguish the figure from the ground. The figure is flying apart and receding into the ground. Now, abstract expressionism was the great culmination of this tendency, this swing of the pendulum in European art. This work by Jackson Pollock called The Deep is all about this. Although it's abstract, as I've said, abstract painting also has this kind of content. All human artifacts, I think, have this kind of content. In Pollock's painting, The Deep, we see through a swirling white mist into like a bottomless abyss of blackness into which the ego is, as it were, invited to dive and submerge itself. The Rothkos, where the floating rectangles go back behind the ground and then up in front of it and where they're very close-hued, are also about this edge. this edge between self and other, where the claims of each are felt equally strongly, and the self is, as it were, just at the point of either emerging from the other or flowing into it. Now, in recent figurative painting, an extremely complex set of devices has been developed, a set of indicators has been developed in representations of the human self. We're going to look through some of them. This is a painting by Alex Katz from the late 50s. Ada in a blue house dress. Alex Katz was a painter who, of course, throughout the period of abstract expressionism continued to paint figuratively and was regarded as totally out of it. Since the so-called return to the figure in the 70s, he is, of course, has been redefined as the father of it all, as it were. And in a sense, it's true. I mean, really, new image painting, for example, does seem to have come to a certain extent out of the example of his work. Anyway, there's several things I want to say about Ada. One is, what is that space she's standing in? What is that ground? It's as if there is no ground, there is no space. She's constricted into some kind of entrapment or bondage, which to me looks like a very shallow space. She is gazing out of that shallow space at our deep space out here, but unlike Madame Recamier, she does not seem to see us. It's as if she is caught in the shallow space of being and ego self and cannot see out of it into a deep space which she nevertheless intuits as being out there. This is a painting by Neil Jenny from 1970 called Woodman and Woodland. Again, the figure is trapped within an extremely shallow space where it seems to have no place to move. Unlike the deep space of Renaissance painting, which was an assertion of human free will, you see, was an assertion of the human ability to move around in the world and do what you wanted to do. What is emerging in this post-war or post-war to post-modern sequence of images of humans is a sense of entrapment within an inadequate space. What this suggests is a lack of free will, a skepticism, a doubt about free will, a doubt that you can really move around in the world and do what you want. Neil Jenny's Woodman is so hemmed in by the brush strokes. Not only is it a very flat space that he inhabits, but he is so hemmed in by those palpable brush strokes that he can't move. He can't even turn around to look at us. It seems as if there's no place for him to go. This is a series of acrylic and pencil drawings by Nicholas Africano of the 1970s called the Battered Woman series. See, up at the top, the battered woman is waiting in terror for her husband to come home. And then, in a moment which we are not shown, he comes home and beats her. And then in the middle series, we see her at the doctor's office, and she has bruised ribs. And then at the bottom, she's seated in the company of a policewoman. Evidently, she is going to bring charges against him, take it to the courts. I guess the man who appears is her husband, because she shouts, "Leave me alone and stop looking at me, you fucker." What I'd like to point out is, psychologically, for one thing, it seems as if we're looking at a drama that really kind of denies human free will. I mean, I know, she goes to the police and all, but still, it's like a tragically mechanical series of events has unfolded. And I want to point out that the rendition of space in the drawings is entirely in harmony with this. All the figures are in profile. They are, as it were, entrapped in such a narrow and inadequate space that they can't even turn around to try to look out of it the way Ada, at least, was trying to look out of it. In this period of Africano's works, his figures are always in profile. They're absolutely, as it were, between glass, caught in a sense of social entrapment, where they no longer have any confidence in their free will and their ability to move about as they would. This is Robert Longo's Corporate Wars from around 1983. Again, it features a narrow entrapping space which now is so exaggeratedly inadequate that people are fighting for the little space that there is. I mean, there's just not enough room there. There's no depth. There's no place you can go. There's no place to get away from the horror of it all, from the sense of social entrapment, lack of free will, and so forth. Now, a lot of this art that we're looking at expresses the sense of occurring in between the Second and Third World Wars. We're looking here at a work by George Baselitz. I'm not just at the moment going to comment on the fact that the figure is upside down. I just want to point out that Baselitz also, like the American artists that we've been looking at, presents an intensely shallow and inadequate space. And again, like Neil Jenny, he hems the figure in by thick dragging marks, dragging like brush strokes, which in Baselitz's work really serve a double function. They not only entrap the figure so that it cannot move, they tend to hold it together. Often in a Baselitz painting, one gets the feeling that the ego that is presented is so trapped and weak and that it has so little access to free will that if it were not hemmed in by this barricade of brush strokes, it would just come apart. In other words, the thing which holds the self together is the same thing that tortures it. Now, we're looking here at a painting by Anselm Kiefer. Here we see an opposite approach to space and the figure. There is a kind of infinite regress of deep space, more than enough space, and there is no figure to inhabit it at all. As it is a direct opposite from, let's say, Robert Longo's vision of a shallow entrapping space in Corporate Wars, of a shallow entrapping space in which there's not enough room for anybody. Of course, Kiefer's work is about World War II. It's about being a German after World War II, and trying to be an artist after World War II. I mean, what could it mean to be a German artist after that, you know? This is one of a series of Kiefer works that he calls Scorched Earth paintings, where he just presents the earth as burned out and ravaged and scraped and a place of death and total emptiness. This, again, a work by Kiefer called The Unknown Painter. The phrase is a parody of the phrase The Unknown Soldier. Again, there is a vast external space, and now also in the distance, what appears to be a vast architectural space, but again, there are no human beings who will inhabit the space. It is as if Kiefer's work is about history, you see, recent history, and its entrapping hold on the present. That's what that inadequate space was about, and that's what this vast but uninhabited space is about also. It's as if Kiefer is presenting a space on which a human drama will work itself out, but he doesn't want to see it because it's going to be too awful. I mean, it's a theater for the next World War that he has presented here. I mean, the more I look at that building in the background, the more I get the feeling that I don't even want to know what's happening in there. Now, this is a work by Robert Longo. Interestingly, Longo, see, this contradiction about a narrow space which entraps the figure and a vast perspectival space which has no figure in it. This contradiction, which, by the way, I think at an almost inarticulate level is a kind of real challenge to architecture. This contradictory sense of how the ego is relating to space runs through the art of the 70s and the art of the 80s and is often found in the works of the same artists. Longo, for example, who has shown us the narrow entrapping space of corporate wars, here, like Kiefer, shows us a vast, almost classically or Renaissance-like perspectival space in which there is no figure. And Neil Jenny, who in Woodman and Woodland showed us that narrow and entrapping space, here again shows us the vast space of the surround of nature with no human figure in it. There is, in this contradictory iconography, the strongest sense that the human ego is, as it were, at the end of the road. That it either has no place to turn or that there really is no one to turn anywhere. Gerhard Richter's deep, misty landscapes of the 70s also work out this iconography. There is never a figure in them. Enzo Kuki presents empty spaces which seem to have been prepared for some horrific ritual. In that sense, a little bit like the Scorched Earth paintings of Kiefer, and again, there is never a human figure portrayed in them. Now, this contradictory approach to space in the new figurative tradition is like a basic fact of the tradition. That these painters present the situation of being a human being in the world as an innately contradictory double bind, as it were. Around this kind of foundation, iconographic foundation about the human situation, a number of other strategies or tactics for presenting human selfhood have arisen. One of them is Baselitz's famous device of presenting his figures upside down. This does a couple of things. For one thing, it tends to move the figures a little bit toward abstraction so that they tend to become confused with the ground often. But also, of course, because this type of formal quality is never without contextual implications, also, of course, the presentation of the figures upside down carries a very clear content. Everything's topsy-turvy. We don't know whether we're coming or we're going. Disoriented, confused, etc. Susan Rothenberg's work of the 70s tended to present fragments of human beings. Fragmentation of the figure, like putting it upside down, is another expression of the sense of kind of ravaged human selfhood of late modernism and postmodernism, or as some might say, of late capitalism. Or really, you know, it's just as it were when the real sense of what has happened in the 20th century caught up with us. I mean, at first, after the war, after the Second World War, we like buffered ourselves against the realization of it by abstract art, by a period when the figure was out, because you can't deal with the figure without confronting this kind of issue directly. The return to the figure, I think, was precisely about the fact that the real import of 20th century history came home, and a real sense of the futility of human ego projections and intentions came home. It also had a lot to do with structuralism and post-structuralism, which were decentering the human self, as the fashionable word became, taking it apart in a variety of ways, and the art of the period of structuralism and post-structuralism embodies this, partly in the fragmentation of the figure, as in these works by Rothenberg, where you may get an arm or a leg or a head or a hand, but it's as if to say that human selfhood really is a broken and scattered thing, and it is not going to necessarily be put back together again. the iconography of Rothenberg's work relates to the iconography of this type of work by Ioannis Kounelis, who makes plaster casts of classical statues, breaks them, burns them, and throws them onto these metal shelves as if they were, you know, maybe in the closet of the archaeologist's shed. It's the wholeness of classical selfhood that was represented by the kouros and by the doryphorus, the spear bearer, that in effect Kounelis is taking and shattering here. He's presenting the classical feeling of selfhood as it was expressed in classical art as an ideal, as something which hovers over us like the broken fragments in the archaeologist's closet, but something which is quite broken and presented as more or less unattainable. There are never enough of the fragments to put back together a human person again. Tony Craig's work of the 70s and early 80s also used this iconography of fragmentation. This work was made by taking found pieces of white plastic, that is garbage, and arranging them on the wall in a silhouette of Michelangelo's David. The David statue, in turn, is, of course, as it were, a kind of faked kouros, or faked spear bearer. So we're looking back through the Renaissance at the classical ideal, and we see it. See, it's not only at two removes. It's not only broken. Its whiteness makes it almost disappear into the ground as if it was of no importance. But finally, it is literal garbage. Another device that painters of the 70s and early 80s have used to express related feelings about human selfhood at the beginning of the postmodern era is the layering of images. This, of course, is a painting by David Sally. The layering of images on top of one another is really kind of a direct translation into a visual form of the post-structuralist view of the self, late structuralist and post-structuralist, which is, as it were, that there is no centering element. There is no overall unity. It's as if, let's say you took a piece of transparent plastic and inscribed on it a fragment of a code, and then took another one and inscribed a fragment of another code of representation on top of it, and then another one, and then put them all on top of one another. In this late structuralist and post-structuralist view, that's really what a human self is. A series of fragmentary and incomplete codes somewhat coherently overlaid on one another. Now one rises to the surface in response to a situation, now another one does. Among them, they give the illusion of a unified selfhood, but in fact, it's like a series of imperfectly received conditionings, which among them do not make up a self. Sally's layering of different codes of representation is like this. See, in the strictly postmodern era, painters have not so much represented things in nature as they have represented modes of representation. One of the conspicuous qualities of the postmodern mentality is an awareness of the relativity of modes of representation, and that any single mode of representation is inadequate to be called real. So that perhaps for the first time in history, this kind of meta step back was taken, where it is modes of representation themselves that are represented, as we have here a kind of a, you know, the mode of the cowboy comic book or magazine overlaid on top of Sally's usual hints at the iconography of pornography. This overlaying of two or more different modes of representation or styles of representation on top of one another suggests this layering of the self and the idea that none of the responses of the self really arise from any center, but always, as it were, from some discarded mode of representation, some extremely partial viewpoint or mode of representation. Sigmar Polke, the German artist, also kind of combines both the motifs of fragmentation and layering to give a similar kind of postmodern sense of the lack of a center to the self. Julian Schnabel's work incorporates a number of this, it kind of unifies a lot of these devices. There are the suggestions of fragmented classical sculptures, the layering of one type of image on top of another, the ambiguity about figure and ground, and of course, in the use of the broken ceramic ware, there is again the motif familiar from Cunelis and Cragg and others of the fragmented nature of the postmodern self. There is also, in works by Schnabel like this one, a sense of an oppressively dense and narrow space in which the figure has no place to go and nothing to do, even if it did. The presence of the human skull, as in this painting, is another really common element of that type in the recent figuration, though I haven't followed it out with more examples. Now, I want to draw a kind of a dichotomy between two ways of relating to our historical situation. And I'm going to epitomize this dichotomy between Anselm Kiefer, the German painter, and Francesco Clementi, the Italian painter of the so-called trans-avant-garde. Kiefer's work is persistently about history, about recent European history. You know, I think it was Theodor Adorno who remarked that after the Holocaust, no art was possible. Art was revealed as absurd or trivial by the actual events of history themselves. Kiefer's work persistently, here we have one of the Scorched Earth paintings. Kiefer's work persistently asks the question, what could it mean to be a European artist after that incredible experience of the Second World War in which the European cultures all but destroyed their own civilization, under no constraints from outside. Kiefer's work continually portrays the idea that we have inherited a moment of history that is burned out, scorched, and ripped apart, and that prettying it up by making pretty pictures of it is like our most inadequate response. This work is called Urd Vedangi Skald. It is the names of three figures from Norse mythology who are known as the three Norns. They are equivalent to the three fates in Greek mythology. They spin out the future, and they are shown lying as like lifeless stumps or logs that are burning on the ground. It's a sense, Kiefer presents us with a sense of the impossibility of seeing our future from where we happen to occur in history. This painting is entitled Die Meister Zinger, after the opera by Richard Wagner, the Master Singers of Nuremberg. Nuremberg, of course, is a huge symbol of the whole Nazi experience and the trials afterwards and so forth. Wagner is widely regarded as a forerunner in German culture of the Nazi ideology. See, Kiefer refuses to turn his eyes away from this stuff. He did a series of photographs where he traveled around France, Italy, and Switzerland, and he would stand in front of some big monument like the Colosseum in Rome in a Nazi-like uniform and have himself photographed there while making the Heil Hitler gesture. And then he published this series of photographs under the heading that he said, I have taken France, Italy, and Switzerland. Anyway, my point is that he refuses to turn his eyes away from this. He constantly uses subject matter from Germanic mythology, from Wagner, oblique hints to the war. Francesco Clementi has responded to the moment of history in an entirely opposite way. The movement of Italian artists known as the trans-avant-garde have chosen to ignore history, to overlook history, to pretend it hasn't happened, to cast their images into a kind of an archetypal mold which suggests eternal mythological realities that are larger than history, within which the oscillations of history, the rising and falling of worlds, become essentially trivialized by the mythological vastness. Here, for example, in a kind of a primeval totemic icon, we see the sun about to set into the ocean, just rising or setting, that primal mythological moment that dominates all of Egyptian mythology and so forth. And we see a naked woman and a donkey making erotic gestures. And the donkey's position is as if his skin is flayed and hung up on the wall. It suggests kind of primitive totemic rituals and mythological moments that are regarded or felt as being essentially outside of history, bigger than history. This painting by Clementi is actually meant to be exhibited 90 degrees that way. You can see the arrow. He put the arrow in to show you how to exhibit it, but anyway, we want to look at it this way. It's a self-portrait of, it's the painter's face himself. He is presented as having no male genitals, perhaps, you know, it's a classical, alchemical, mythological hermaphrodite icon. This is the kind of thing that Clementi is into as source material. Alchemical texts, mythological texts and diagrams and such. His heart in his chest reveals itself, like, say, the heart of Christ. He has just flung a book over his shoulder with his right hand. He stands in an extremely, a posture suggestive of the female and the softness with which he shows himself. Again, he presents himself, he presents the artist as someone who has no need to confront history, really, but who deals with mythological verities which transcend history. Now, we're going to enter into another sequence here. This is a painting by Eric Fischl. Fischl's work is based in part on references to popular media, open references to popular media. Specifically, he tends to combine hints of two different types of representation, but without the layered style that Sally uses, for example. Fischl, one of Fischl's characteristic modes of representation, again, is pornography. There are deliberate allusions to the pornographic imagery in much of his work, and then he combines this with a kind of 50s movies view of suburbia. This is essentially his trip. He is combining implications of hidden pornographic realities with the kind of placid Hollywood view of suburbia. This is a painting by Richard Bosman, which Bosman takes his imagery from comic books and boys' novels, the illustrations in boys' novels. This one is called Tracks, and as we can see, it represents a mode of representation. It doesn't represent a thing in the world. we see a kind of comic book figure with a gun following a set of tracks through the snow. There is an ideological implication behind this work that underlies a lot of work of the period, and that is that media influences make us what we are and guide us into murderous actions. This is a work by Ed Paschke. Ed Paschke presents the human face and figure as out-of-focus TV images. They are literally, the human selfhood is presented as literally constituted by media, as having nothing to it except media. Tune it this way, tune it that way. Now it looks, change its color, change its shape, change its size. It is like all media. Nam June Paik, in a series of works of the 70s, presented a similar view of human selfhood as a solipsistic relationship with media. You look at media and you see yourself and it shows you yourself, so then you become that. And then you look at it more and it is like, you know, a circuit, a closed circuit. I like this one even better. Much of the art of the 70s and early 80s expresses less a feeling of the burden of the past than a feeling of anxiety and concern for the future. This work by Jonathan Borofsky, Green Painting with Chattering Man, the two pieces go together. I mean, they are one piece. You know, these chattering men that he makes, their jaws move up and down endlessly, and a kind of nonsense babble comes out of a little speaker in their mouth. Judging from other elements in Borofsky's work and his iconography, one can say that the green whirlpool-like painting is, for Borofsky, an image of World War III. And the chattering man looks at the threat of apocalypse and just babbles senselessly on, caught up with his language and unable to do anything about the approaching vortex of the end. A prisoner of his language. This is a painting by Roger Brown, who, again, is obviously a representation of a mode of representation. Rather, I mean, he's not looking at something in the world and trying to represent it. Roger Brown uses comic book style to present an unending series of catastrophes. Again, there is something about the influence of media. There is something about these tiny human figures who are usually fleeing catastrophes, earthquakes, bombings, their helplessness, their lack of options, their entrapment in this comic book world, which is presented as terrifically terrifying and yet essentially ridiculous. This work by Dieter Hocker, which is called The Power That Comes Down from Heaven, presents nuclear reactors with a fallout cloud hanging over them. Robert Morris's recent work shows in the center this kind of firestorm of nuclear explosion, and then all around the outside, sculpturally torn fragments of human bodies. What one would have to call it apocalyptic work. This painting by Jed Garrett seems to show a human male and female embracing in a procreative act at the moment, the hopeless moment of the apocalypse. And this post-apocalyptic work by Jed Garrett, called The Last Couple, shows a man and woman in the devastated landscape after a nuclear war. Jean-Michel Basquiat's work of the period I think is essentially post-apocalyptic work also. He presents these terrifying icons of a human selfhood which has reverted to a kind of insane savagery. Fragments of language, fragments of broken language, meaninglessly used, tend to float around in the air. This is the last of the slides that I've brought here to show you. It's a painting by James Brown, which also suggests a post-apocalyptic era in which the goals and moods of civilization will have given way to a type of savagery again. So obviously I've made it come out in such a way that the last images we see look kind of like the first one we saw, so that it seems cyclical and wrapped up. But the only concluding point I want to make is, of course, that what all of the complexity of the critical device in recent figurative work adds up to a big question mark. This recent representational painting has revealed not only the shifting status of representational means, that is, their relativity, but also a deep anxiety about human nature and the future of our shared human project of civilization. At this close of a millennium, the general loss of faith in representation, that is, the fact that image reification is really kind of out of style, has in a sense increased its usefulness. It's given it more of a critical edge. Naive representation, that is to say image reification, believing that a certain representation really is real, is always a kind of giving into a dream. What passes for real or objective representation in the postmodern era is the representation of methods of representation. This process has called up a kind of review of all of the various dreams of what humanity thought it was at various times along its path, along with a real sharp awareness of their dreamlike status. So I'm going to stop there. I understand there's going to be a little reception, so I think what I'll do is just go there and be available to answer questions or chat with you there rather than to ask for questions right now.